Building Nordic ski waxing stands is turning into a bit of a strange obsession for me. I really thought I was just going to build one as a Christmas gift, but then I decided I needed one for myself, then I built one for a friend, then I decided to see if I could build one that was lighter and cheaper than the last one I built. So I'm 4 stands in, and I keep thinking of ways to make it better. So the next thing I wanted to fix was the design of the ski supports. The L3 design used less wood than the previous designs, and once it was done, the design really looked like it should fold. Like right here. If it folded there, the stand would take up less space when it's stored. So that was the inspiration for this next step in ski wax stand design obsession. Once parts have to start moving, design precision becomes a lot more important. To reduce the amount of trial and error, I used SketchUp for some preliminary 3D design work. I've used it for a few projects in the past, so I'm familiar enough with it that I can spend my time designing rather than learning the software. I started with a platform similar to what I'd used for the L3 design, but I put in 2 pivot points so that the arms would fold down with the platform flat on top. The process started with cutting a couple of strips of cherry and spacing them with maple to accommodate the bolts through the base. I used 5/16" bolts, so the maple filler strips that create the gap in the center are the same width as the bolts that the supports attach to. The supports are about 14 inches long, but they could probably be longer, and the width is 2¼ inches, which is the same width as the base that they attach to. Once I glued them up, I let the glue set up a bit before scraping it off, which I'll admit never seems to go that well for me. I either let it get too dry so it's hard to remove, or it's too soft and I still have to wipe off wet glue. So anyway, once the glue was completely dry, I ran them through the planer to clean the glue off the surface and make sure they were still flat. I also softened all the edges using the belt sander. If you've watched my other ski wax stand videos, this next step is familiar. After the bases were glued up and planed, I worked on the ski supports where the skis rest. The support for the tail of the skis is just a straight board about 14 inches long, but this length is really arbitrary, and I think it might be better if it was longer, so I'll try that on the next build. There's not much to do with it other than to soften the lower edges. I don't soften the upper edges because I'm going to be putting cork on the top, so the sharp edge on the top isn't really exposed. The tip support is a little more complicated than the tail support. To support the curved profile of the ski tip, I glue a short piece of wood to one end so there'll be space to cut more of the curved profile. If I had planned ahead, I would have glued this up earlier, but since I didn't, I will glue the pieces together after I've roughed in the profile. With the 2 pieces of wood positioned together but not yet glued, I traced the profile of the ski tip onto the edge of the wood. I should probably make a template for this so that I don't have to haul out a ski to trace each time. With the ski tip profile traced onto the wood, I started roughing in the shape of the curve by removing some of the wood on the miter saw. This was not a very efficient method for accomplishing the task. I can't remember why I did it this way instead of using the bandsaw, but I'm sure I had a really good reason at the time. Anyway, after gluing the 2 pieces together and giving the glue a day to set, I set to work with a belt sander to turn the support tip into a smooth curve. With the base and the top support board set to go, it was time to work on the mechanism that will allow the support to fold and unfold. There are essentially 3 pieces to this mechanism: the pivot arms and the hinge points for the base and the top support boards. A combination of machine screws, washers, and lock nuts will allow the pieces to move. Starting with the pivot arms, they're cut to length at approximately 6 inches, and then the ends are angled at 45 degrees on both sides and on both ends. Once the shape is established, holes were drilled in both ends of the pivot arms, and then the holes were countersunk so that the hardware sits below the surface of the wood. The machine screws have a screw head on one end, and the other end has a lock nut with a nylon washer, which will hopefully stop it from coming loose when the arms pivot. Once the lock nut is flush with the surface of the wood, it's not possible to hold it with a wrench, so the nut is also firmly embedded into the wood of the pivot arm. I do this by creating a countersink hole, which is just a bit smaller than the nut, and then tightening the screw using a screwdriver so that it pulls the nut into the wood. This makes a very firm connection between the nut and the wood. However, I didn't drill a large enough countersink hole the first time, so when I tightened in the nut, it split the wood a little bit. So eventually I had to go back and cut another pivot arm to replace this one. With the pivot arms cut and drilled, the next step was to create the pivot blocks. The pivot blocks are essentially a trapezoid shape that attaches directly to the sliding base and the ski supports with screws. The pivot arms will use the machine screws to connect to the top and bottom pivot blocks. I cut the pivot blocks from one strip of wood and made the angle 45 degrees, but that angle is mostly just for aesthetics. The hole for the machine screw to go through was measured to be in the center of the block and 3/8 of an inch from the bottom. I later realized that it worked better if the hole was also vertically centered, so that when the stand was folded down, the pivot arms would be horizontal to the base and ski support. This doesn't matter from a functional perspective, but it looks better, so I eventually redid the pivot blocks as well. But in the meantime, I drilled the holes in the pivot blocks and then added a very shallow countersink using a spade bit. The slight countersink will be for a washer, as there will be 2 washers between each pivot arm and the pivot block. After this project, I went out and bought a set of Forstner bits, which do a much better job of creating countersinks for washers because they create a nice flat bottom hole. The countersink is just enough so the washer sits slightly above the surface of the pivot arm. To join the ski supports to the pivot blocks, I drilled 2 holes from the top of the support and countersunk the holes so that the screw head would be below the surface of the wood. The tops will eventually be covered in cork, so the screws are out of the way. I marked and drilled holes in the pivot blocks to align with the holes in the ski support and then screwed the support to the pivot block. I checked to make sure they were parallel, and they mostly were. I changed the process for doing this the next time so that I didn't have as many alignment issues. Once the pivot blocks were attached to the ski supports, I could assemble the pivot arms. This process involves 4 machine screws and 20 washers to complete both supports. The lengths of machine screws that I ended up needing were not standard lengths, so I cut longer screws to length using an angle grinder after I determined the correct length. In order to lock the pivot arms up at a 45-degree angle when they're opened up, I cut a small block of wood with a 45-degree angle on one end. This angle lock block was attached to the end of the sliding base so that the top of the angle lock would stop the pivot arms at the right spot. Pilot holes were drilled in the bottom of the angle block to line up with holes in the sliding base, and they were joined with screws. With the angle lock in place, it was time to attach the pivot arms. I started by marking, drilling, and countersinking holes in the base. Then those hole positions were transferred to the pivot block and drilled so that the pieces could all be screwed together. Here's the fully assembled piece. As you can see in the lower image, the top, bottom, and pivot arms form a Z. But you can see in the final version on the top that I had recut the pivot blocks so the pivot arms were parallel with the top and the bottom. Before final assembly, I took everything apart and applied 4 coats of varnish and rubbed them down with 4-0 steel wool between coats. Once the varnish was fully cured, I reassembled everything again. Then I attached the cork to the top of the ski supports using contact cement. Once the 2 pieces come in contact with the contact cement on them, you can't pull them apart again, so you have to make sure you get this right the first time. The ski supports were designed to be used on a previously designed ski waxing stand, which is supported by a sawhorse. Once the supports are in place, you can put a ski on them, adjust the position of the supports, and lock the ski binding to the center post. You can tighten the center post to make sure the ski doesn't move when you're waxing, and the final step would be to unfold the legs of the blue sawhorse that the wax stand is sitting on. If you want to save $20 and not buy the sawhorse, you can use the stand independently if you have some other bench to mount it on. If you have a workbench like I have here, you can simply take a ski wax stand assembly and clamp it to your bench like this. One clamp would probably be enough, but I'm putting on two just to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. This gives a nice firm working base, and of course you can use the bench top to hold your wax, brushes, and waxing iron. Alternatively, if you happen to have an old Black & Decker workmate, do they still make these? Or something similar, you can use it to support the ski supports and the base. Finally, if you really want to keep costs down and minimize your storage requirement, you can simply clamp each of the ski supports directly to your bench. After you've got the two supports clamped, you use a third clamp to adjust how tightly the ski is held to the supports. This means you only have to store 3 relatively small pieces of the ski waxing stand, as well as your clamps, and of course you have to have a bench to mount it on. That's the folding ski wax stand supports. I really like how compact these supports make the ski waxing stand that they mount on, so I'll continue to use these in future designs. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. I've got a couple more stand ideas coming which will hopefully lead to the ultimate waxing stand, and then I can move on to something else.